take any point, any gadol in Jewish history, it talks about Judaism. It's not just be who you are, it's become who you should be. You might say the guiding principle of what it is to be a Jew is not to stop and be self-satisfied, but always to be looking to become a better person in relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and in relationship to your self-honesty as far as that goes. So I think that's what Tzniut is going to be all about, is coming to that realization that we are not finished products, that we must finish ourselves, and that you have a lifetime to do it, even though that may not be enough.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Any discussion surrounding Tzniut, loosely, and as we'll see perhaps incorrectly translated as modesty, is inevitably fraught with challenges and difficulty. After all, there are few topics in Orthodoxy that are as triggering to so many people. I noticed this myself with the very energetic feedback I received last year when the Orthodox Conundrum released 2 episodes dedicated to the topic of Tzniut. Episode 145 with Shana Goldberg, and episode 159 with Bracha Polyakov and Rabbi Anthony Manning. My guests in both of those podcasts offered very valuable insights, and I strongly recommend that you listen to them carefully. Rabbi Moshe Simkovich has a parallel yet unique approach to Tzniut, and he attempts to redefine the concept altogether, moving it further away from quantitative questions about dress and sexuality, and toward a vision that, he says, is more in line with what the word means in Tanach and according to Chazal. In this episode, he explains his traditional and innovative approach. We deliberately kept the discussion away from the typical conversation surrounding Tzniut and instead talked about how it applies to other areas, particularly to questions surrounding leadership. Apart from helping to reframe the definition of Tzniut, this also allowed us to analyze why Tzniut is an important quality for leaders, how it is potentially manifest in leadership, examples and counterexamples of such leadership, ways to inculcate this quality, why humble leadership is not the same as tzanua leadership, and some clues about how to determine if a potential leader possesses the characteristic of Tzniut. When all is said and done, using leadership as an example of Tzniut also allows us to better understand how Tzniut can and should be implemented in areas like sexuality and dress. We'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, let me remind you to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. The link is in the description of this podcast, so get your free subscription today. And finally, remember that JCH Podcast Productions is the best place for you to go in order to produce your podcast from start to finish. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com so that we can discuss helping you make a high-quality, professional, and popular podcast. Rabbi Moshe Simkovich has been a head of school, congregational rabbi, educational consultant, and educator in yeshivot and Jewish communities in the United States and Israel. Since the 1980s, he has been instrumental in the founding of a number of successful synagogues and Torah institutions. On a personal note, Rabbi Simkovich is my Rebbe, and probably the person most responsible for helping me develop my own Torah hashkafa over the past 35 or 40 years. For that reason, it was a true honor and pleasure to host Rabbi Simkovich on the podcast this week. Rabbi Moshe Simkovich, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast. I'd like to open up today with a quote from Chaim Seiman and Avital Shita Goldschmidt, who wrote in a recent issue of Tradition from spring 2024 an article entitled Materialism and the Rise of Modern Orthodoxy. There's a comma after modern and then orthodoxy. Here's the quote, and I'd like to hear your comments on this, Rabbi Simkovich. Over the last several decades, Tzniut has been reformatted from a broad, if loosely defined, halachic concept into a set of precise rules governing female dress. Though remarkably successful at impacting the wardrobe of frum women, our analysis confirms that educating towards an ideal of Tzniut, which serves as an attitudinal principle that forms and shapes the social perspectives, has achieved more limited success. So, Rabbi Simkovich, as a way to begin our conversation, do you think that their description of the way that Tzniut is treated and taught is accurate?
Yes, primarily when people talk about Tzniut, with a particular exception that I'll mention in a second, the main focus seems to be on sexuality and sexual propriety. It's a sort of, I think, an effect of living in the American culture where that sort of sexuality and its limits is a main value. It's how people identify themselves. But I would question, is that the way Jews should be identifying themselves? Is basically an effect of their sexual being is what they are all about. Now, the exception I had in mind is, it comes to my mind, Reb Meir Twersky, in commemorating his father, spoke a couple of times about his father's Tzniut. And that was a highly important aspect of the Tolner Rebbe, Rav Yitzchak Twersky's personality. And there, the conversation had nothing to do with sexuality. And I think this consciousness, this self awareness that we ought to be striving for, of the sort that Rav Twersky represented, is something that's sorely lacking. And particularly when we talk about tzniut, the fact that it hardly ever comes up, but where somebody's skirt reaches above the knee or below the knee seems to be so important, is to me an aberration, because tzniut should be part of each person's personality.
Okay, and we're going to get to some of that and some of these attitudinal issues in just a moment. Before we go there, I'd like to push back on one particular issue. When you say that it comes out of an American milieu, I would argue that living here in Israel, as you have for many years as well in the past, Israeli tzniut may be even more focused on dress than American, if anything. It's not a matter of here in Israel we have the correct attitudes. If anything, in much of the Orthodox world, tzniut is exclusively defined in terms of sexuality.
That may very well be true, and we're all part of Western culture and how Westerners present themselves and the reactions to not be drawn into it. I think you're right. It's all of one piece, a little more stress in one place on one aspect or another aspect, but it's a problem. And I'm looking forward to this conversation that we're going to have here as a sort of an opening to talking about tzniut in ways that do not revolve around sexual propriety, but about the building of human personality.
I think a conversation like that is absolutely crucial, particularly because we know that tzniut can be very triggering to many people. In fact, in two previous episodes, in episode 145 with Shana Goldberg and in episode 159 with Bracha Polyakov and Rabbi Anthony Manning, we talked about tzniut in new kinds of ways that try to de-emphasize this emphasis on clothing. Today, Rabbi Simkovich, I believe that we're going to do that even more so, barely mentioning sexuality and clothing at all and trying to understand what tzniut truly is. You told me that there are three basic sources for the use of the term tzanua or tzniut in Tanach. And, spoiler alert, not one of them talks about tzniut as mainly a sexual principle. As a way of beginning this reformatting, could you present these three texts?
Sure. We'll start with one from Micha Perek Vav. Higid lecha adam ma tov u'ma Hashem doresh mimcha. Let me tell you what's good and what God wants of you. Ki masot mishpat v'avat chesed. Okay, to do justice and to love benevolence or goodness. But here's our point. V'hatznei alechet im Elokecha, and to walk with tzniut, with your God. Usually that's translated as modestly, but I would argue that it's not so much about modesty as having a certain attitude. So if you look at some of the sources that are in, for example, Masechet Sukkah, they deal with how this concept, first of all, relates to learning Torah, and also how it relates to doing mitzvot. So I'll just quickly give a touch upon that. What's the meaning of what is written, the hidden areas of your thighs, which offhand does sound somewhat sexual. Lama nimshalu divrei Torah kiyar. But here we're going to draw it into its use for understanding how matters of Torah link to this. Lomar lecha. It teaches you that just as one would think that there's certain parts of the body that should be covered up, also when you learn Torah, The optimal way to do it is in a covered up private way where you really relate to the other person in front of you and not for public display. That's learning Torah. And that's going to be a theme in Chazal's interpretation of many of these sources. But there's also a second one there in the Gemara that Amar Rebbe Elazar, my dichtiv hiyilacham adam, etc., hatznei alechet im lakecha. So he says, asot mishpat zahadin, to do justice, that's law. Avat chesed, zukmilat chesedim. Avat chesed is benevolence. Vatznei alechet im lakecha, zo hotzaat hametvach nasat kala lechupa. That's even if you're at a levaya, if you're at a burial, or if you're accompanying a bride to the chuppah, this principle of hatznei alechet applies in these very public situations. V'halod dvarim kal v'chomer. Umad dvarim shedarchem lasotim b'farhesia amra Torah hatznei alechet. Just like the way of doing these things is public, but the Torah says, do it in a way that is more private. Dvarim shedarchem lasotim b'tzina, things that are by their nature private, alachet kama v'kama, all the more so. In other words, integrity in what you're doing should be not only the same in private as in public, but the essence of the meaningfulness comes from how you would act on your own. And here, if you're on your own, would you do the same thing as you do publicly? This is an important principle that we must pay attention to if we want to fulfill the intent of the Torah. Do things with integrity.
Just so I can understand properly, Rabbi Simkovich, does that mean in your reading of this that you should act almost as if nobody's watching you? In other words, I am doing the thing that I would do, assuming that I were the only person here. If this were a mate mitzvah, if this were a burial where I am the only person burying the dead body, I would act a certain way. If I were the only person at this wedding, I would act a certain way. The fact that there might be 300 or 500 people around me right now, I should act exactly the same way. Is that how you're defining hatznei alechet as integrity?
That's right. Your actions speak for themselves no matter who is watching, because ultimately the only person who matters here is you in your relationship with God.
Interesting. Let's move on to the second source, which I believe is from Mishlei.
Okay, so here, this is Mishlei Perek Yud Aleph. Pasuk says, Bazadon v'yavo kalon v'eit sinuim chachma, which when zadon, which is often interpreted as arrogance, when some arrogance appears, that will lead to kalon, to disgrace. But the tznuim, the people who are going to act in the right way, have chachma. They approach it with chachma, or maybe the result of the way they act will be chachma. And I say they're both possible because Amar Rabbi Chanina in the Yerushalmi, Chanina Antonio, Brit Kruta hi, Hayagea Talmudo Betzina, Lo Bimhera hu Mishkach, Matam Be'et Tznuim Chachma. That if somebody learns, and when he learns with this quality of tzniut, with this degree of great private integrity, he will not forget what he learns, because he's not doing it to impress anyone. He's doing it to make this thing part of his personality. And so God says, you have a brit, we make a covenant that if you act this way, I will help you keep that which you make of your learning Torah. But I would, even though the Yerushalmi puts it to learning Torah, I would go one step further and say, anybody who acts out of arrogance invites disgrace, no matter what they're doing, whether it's learning Torah or any other public action, and to, in particular, what we'll talk about later, political action. If you're doing things in an arrogant way, then you're going to end up somehow disgracing yourself. But if you're wise, or if you want to act wisely, you do it b'tzniut. You do it with a sense of integrity, and you will not trip over yourself.
Okay. Interesting. Let's go into the third pasuk, okay?
Okay, so this is in Tehillim, Perek Mem Hey, which it's actually is a very strange pasuk in context, because there it's talking about, in general, a princess who's becoming part of the Jewish establishment somehow in Israel, but it could even be a foreign princess. And that's what it looks like from context. But then this pasuk appears there, and Chazal do something else with it that is not part of their context. Kol kvuda bat melech penima mimishbesod zahav levusha. If you're the king's daughter, you should have something glorious within you. And your clothing then becomes intertwined, inwrought with gold. So, in a way, it's a strange pasuk. It begs for all sorts of interpretations. Rashi says, Kol kvuda bat melech penima, otam shel kol kavod talui behem, vehem knesiot shel melech, those who deserve honor, which may refer to the large gatherings of the king in the national sense, asher nagu atzmam b'tzniut, if they act with a degree of tzniut, ata bigdeim chashuvim, then their clothing will be more chashuv, will be more honorable or more esteemed, mimishbasot zahav, than beautiful gold lace clothing, shel kohanim gedolim, even that clothing of the Kohen Gadol. Their outside then will demonstrate a sort of inwardness that has great depth. And so, in other words, who they are on the inside will reflect outside, but because of who they are on the inside. And so it's not false clothing.
So tell me if this is right, if I'm understanding correctly. This last pasuk from Tehillim, in some ways, is the most similar to what we classically think of as tzniut in dress, but the reverse, because it's saying not that you dress in order to feel a certain way or to demonstrate something, but rather the external dress is representative of how you actually are on the inside. Is that true?
Right. And the whole point is the integrity here plays that if you are so and so on the inside, if you have a sense of your relationship to Kadosh Baruch Hu on the inside, then this will reflect on your outside. And there are other different texts that also bring this out further, that this becomes an important principle. For example, just to sum up a medrash in Bamidbar Rabbah, not to go through it point by point, but right at the beginning of Bamidbar Rabbah, Moshe is identified as this Bat Melech, which in itself is kind of interesting. But as he is playing that role of Melech, what gives what he does its meaningfulness and importance, which is his receiving the Torah, is the fact that he does his tzniut. And it says, look at where Moshe gets the Torah. Moshe started at the sneh. He started in a place that was all alone.
You're speaking of the burning bush.
Out in the midbar, in the bush. And then when he comes to get the Torah at Sinai, so he gets it at Sinai. He's on top of the mountain. That's the essence, the essential point of where he receives it. And then when they leave Sinai, they go on. And what becomes the purpose of the Mishkan is that that is the place where Moshe receives the ongoing giving of the Torah. And all the clarifications is when he goes into the Ohel Moed on his own. Again, but tzniut. It's almost like it's begging, even though this is not said in the Medrash, the word sneh sounds like tzniut. And it's almost inviting, and Sinai sounds like sneh. It's inviting the concept that the essence of all these things is something that has to reflect the deep integrity. And that deep integrity is a personal quality, which one must foster, one must work at and attain. And without that, things just become superficial.
Let me ask about that concept of integrity, because we have come to this definition of tzniut as integrity, reflecting how you are really. This is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but there are going to be people who will say, I'm sorry, this is who I am. And in that sense, there's integrity, but someone might say, you know what, maybe you should be less of who you are. Because just because somebody is something doesn't mean that that should be their goal of who they should be. Sometimes people are something and they have integrity in that they act like a jerk because, hey, that's who I am. I act like a jerk. So in what sense do we look at integrity as being something that reflects a positive quality as opposed to, I don't want to be fake, so therefore I'm going to be very loud or obnoxious or whatever else because that's who I really am?
Okay, well, as a Jewish people, I'd say our goal is to become B'nai Torah. And it has been a clear goal throughout the Torah to see it as a guide to develop ourselves. Take any point, any gadol in Jewish history, it talks about Judaism. It's not just be who you are, it's become who you should be. And this, you can take it all the way back, but that quality certainly is reflected in what the Rambam says. It's certainly the whole theme of the Mesilat Yesharim. Is certainly, you might say, the guiding principle of what it is to be a Jew is not to stop and be self-satisfied, but always to be looking to become a better person in relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and in relationship to your self-honesty as far as that goes. So I think that's what Tzniut is going to be all about, is coming to that realization that we are not finished products, that we must finish ourselves, and that you have a lifetime to do it, even though that may not be enough.
Let me ask something about that and that sense of integrity, because I see something which could be a contradiction, and I'm curious how you would answer this problem. Let's say, for example, going back to what the Gemara said about acting in front of a funeral or a wedding as you would as if you were the only person there. Sometimes, because people are around us, we might act better. It might be fake. But on the other hand, perhaps for the wrong reasons, we might end up acting more respectfully, with a bit more dignity than we would if no one else were watching. So in that sense, it sounds almost as though the ideal of tzniut, that personal integrity, can be violated by a different concept, which is that I should try to be the best that I should be. If I truly am acting with integrity, though, and I'm not there yet, even if it's my ultimate goal, then how can I be tzanua, act with integrity, if I'm not really that person yet? It's just something that I'm striving to be when the Gemara says, act as if nobody's really watching.
Well, that's, if you think back to all the discussions of mitoch lo lishma balishma, things like that, yeah, part of becoming who you are starts with examining the environment you live in and the things that seem to be valued there, and to try to develop that based on that. But you have to have a certain sense of, I'm not just doing it to show that, I fit in, or that I'm doing it by rote, we've always been critical of anashim melumadim, people who do things by rote. We want to use that as a lever to make ourselves better on the inside, in the sense of, yes, if I'm dancing really well in front of the chassan and kala, which is something I can't do that well, but let's say I'm trying, can I make at least the level of simcha that I'm supposed to be sharing very present, not just in my outward affect, but in my inward being, to bring along this chatan and kala to a wonderful life? And that's, I think, the social context is very important, but it can't stop there.
Perhaps, and tell me if this is correct in your view, the very first Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch talks about Shiviti Hashem lenegdi tamid. I place Hashem before me always, which means that along those same lines, when you say the social context is important, ultimately, if I really have a true awareness of God's presence at all times, I'm always in a social context because I truly believe that God is always watching me. So even though the Gemara might say, do it as if nobody's watching, the caveat is, except for God, who of course is watching. Once you realize that, and you recognize that God is watching, then your integrity will naturally go towards acting in such a way that even though no one else really matters in terms of what they think of me, I want to make sure that I am doing something that God would, so to speak, be proud of.
Yeah, I would say even in that context of that Ramah that you just quoted, you see what it goes on into there, that you shouldn't be ashamed. You shouldn't have busha if people mock you when you're serving God. Now that's public, but it continues from there. And it says, yes, gam hatzneah lechet there in those circumstances. But I think the same principle applies to the next phrase, that when you wake up or when you lie in your bed and go sleep, you should remember who you're before. And when you wake up, you go immediately and you try and respond to God. You're yakum bizrizut la'avodat baro. You immediately get up. Why? Because even in your sleep, so to speak, has this element of tzniut. It is so incorporated in your personality that your waking thoughts are, immediately when you awake, relating you to Kadosh Baruch Hu. It's like if you want to live with integrity, that means even your dreams have some integrity. And you think, well, that's not voluntary what you dream. Yeah, to some extent it isn't. But it does reflect what you think about in the day. And what we're saying here is, in return, what you think about within yourself, even in your depths and in your subconscious, should create an umbrella effect to what you are on the outside as well. So that when you awaken and you live your life, the sense of integrity is so incorporated that it's inseparable from who you are.
So we've said that from Micha, we learn largely about the concept of tzniut as it applies to doing mitzvot. From Mishlei, we talk about it in terms of learning. And then from Tehillim, talking about it perhaps we could say clothing, but more obviously in terms of leadership. So I'd like to move into that direction and ask you, Rabbi Simkovich, in what way would this concept of integrity as a theoretical norm apply directly and actively to leadership? How would I make that something which people can actually live by rather than something they just say and sounds nice but doesn't actually affect their behavior? How can we affect behavior of leaders with integrity, with tzniut?
Okay, so I'm not sure how you mean this question, whether it is how we can help leaders do that or how we ourselves can become.
I'll ask both. Maybe I'll start off with how we can become, and then we can apply it to leadership.
Okay, so I'm not sure that there is a magic formula to become, but I think you have to start with what is really your goal in life. You have to look at yourself and you have to know yourself and then say, I want this to be a goal. And saying this, I want to bring up something that is commonly confused, which is, and particularly with Moshe Rabbeinu, we know that he was anav, and yet, according to the medrash that I mentioned before, he's also known as tzanua.
Let me just translate those terms. Anav is humble, generally understood, and tzanua is what we're talking about today, modest or tzniut.
Right. And so I would not use the word modest for tzniut. And with anava, I would also want to play with that definition. To be an anav means, if Moshe was an anav, Moshe was the greatest person in history. How did he accomplish it if he was going around being, modest all the time and humble? That's not realistic. What Moshe was an anav, what we mean is Moshe knew his strengths and knew his weaknesses and knew what to do with them, knew how to appropriate and knew how to respect what God had given him. And when in doubt, he was honest with himself. We see one point in his life, he loses it. Once, 40 years leading, Am Yisrael through the Midbar. It's amazing. To be an anav means you have to know how to use your abilities. Great people of Moshe's sort have anivut. They're not trying to fake their way or bully their way no, they are who they are because they know who they are. Now, that leads to the integrity aspect, which is separate, which is if you have tzniut, that means that the things you are going to do are going to have the integrity of representing who you really are. And therefore, when you succeed, you'll succeed because not in a way because you played people right or because your PR campaign did the job well, but because people look at you with great respect. And also that respect comes from who you really are. And they know it. So I'll give an example from Tanach, Chizkiyahu HaMelech. So God tells Chizkiyahu in Perek Chav in Malachim Bet, look, you're sick, you're going to die. I don't want to get into why, but I do want to say that Chizkiyahu's tefillah represents and it really exhibits this sort of inner sensitivity. What is his tefillah? Ana Hashem, Zecharna, et asher hitalachti lefanecha be'emet. Look, God, please, God, remember I have always walked before you be'emet, with integrity. That's what emet is. Things I say, I actually mean. I do. I act. I'm true to myself. Ubelev shalem, and wholeheartedly, wholly conscious of it. And I've tried to do the good things. And so God responds to Chizkiyahu and says, okay, you've got yourself a further lease on life. It's that sort of integrity and leadership that you want to sort of drive people towards considering. Now, that was not on Ivut, what I was talking about. It wasn't Chizkiyahu knowing his limits and knowing his strengths. It's knowing that he did things be'emet, and that is Tzniut.
Okay, so let me just summarize that if I can understand correctly. When we talk about humility, the kind of humility that Moshe exemplified, we're talking about what I've always said as look at your own paper. You know exactly who you are. What he does doesn't matter. What somebody else does doesn't matter. That person has his strength. She has her strengths. I have my strengths and I have my weaknesses. Knowing exactly who you are and being cognizant of that and not judging yourself based on anybody else, but based on what you can do, that exemplifies the concept of being an ana, of being what we'll call humble, at least in this context. Whereas Tzniut is not about not looking at anybody else's paper. It's simply not relevant to the question. It's more just whatever you do with integrity. It's almost not an emotion. It's a way of looking at life, a way of acting in such a way that I'm true to myself. Is that a fair distinction?
That's right. It's a commitment. And you think back to the pasuk in Mishlei. The person is told, don't be arrogant, be a tzanua and have chachma. How do you do that? By staying connected to the amitut of who you are and not trying to push people around and not trying to PR people into thinking a certain way. Given the way the world works now, that's a very difficult goal because one of the first things that somebody gets when they create a campaign is their PR crew.
So now we're getting into leadership, obviously. When we talk about being tzanua in leadership, and the very first thing that anybody does in a democratic society, and I think we're all for democratic societies here, though, is you run for office, which means presenting yourself in a specific way. And I'm wondering how that can really work with Tzniut as an ideal, as opposed to something which you try and sort of kick to the side because you want to put your best foot forward.
Okay, it is a demand. A person has to work at being honest with themselves, making integrity a very basic principle. But I think if we look at it historically, we do find people who, in our experience, who represent that at certain points. So one test of this, I would say, is does a leader know when to leave? Does a leader know that I've stayed whole with the purpose that I've striven for my whole life and I'm doing the best I can, but right now it's counterproductive. I'm going to undo what I'm doing. The only reason I'd stay in my position is because I have this position. It's a really cool position and I want to keep it, even though that would undermine what they're trying to accomplish. So I would say, let's say you look at American history. I'll take examples from American history. I'll take examples from Israel's modern history. So in America, two people who are good examples of walking away because they had the sense of, I can't do more of my job the way I want to. I would be staying on just because I have the position. Is first of all, Washington. He could have been king. He was offered to be king. He said no. And when after 8 years was done, he said, I'm checking out. Somebody else should take over. I've done my job as creating the paradigm of what leadership should be in this country. I have done my job as president. Somebody else can do it now. It's not about me. It's about the role I have taken on and doing it with integrity, being honest to myself about it. I think somebody else now should take over. We have other presidents who did it. Like, to me, someone like Truman comes to mind. Somebody who said, okay, well, he might very well have lost the next election anyways, but I think he basically saw that his purpose was done and that for him to try to retain the position won't allow him to accomplish the goals that he wanted to during the Korean War, which is not going on. He felt somebody else ought to take charge. And even, although I can imagine some people would argue against this, is Lyndon Johnson, when he got to the point where he said, Vietnam War is going bad. My leadership has been faulty. I've accomplished great things with trying to create a better society in the United States. But now it's all cut up in Vietnam. And what I am doing is useless. He checked out. Yes, he might have had disappointments and he might have had other things that were pushing him that way. But I think if you see him speaking on the spot when he leaves the elective process, I think you see that coming out in his person.
I find it fascinating when you talk about Washington in particular, because Washington has been called by historians the indispensable man, the one person without whom the American Revolution could not have happened. Everybody else was very important, whether we're talking about Madison or Jefferson or Adams or Franklin. But the indispensable individual, the one who really held it together in ways that nobody else could, is George Washington, who also represents that concept of integrity. It's interesting how they sort of go together in that sense. The only person who could have been addressed as His Royal Highness in American history, yet chose to act with the type of integrity that was true to the ideals that he fought for.
I think that's absolutely right. And in a way, I wonder, even just because you brought this up, I wonder if you couldn't say the same thing about the other George III, that he also acted with integrity to his role as he saw it. And
we're throwing a bone to the British listeners right now.
Yeah, but he just didn't read the world correctly. You know, this the sense of tzniut in politics doesn't mean you go hide. It means that you are going to act with integrity.
And I think those examples, by the way, really do represent and demonstrate the difference between humility, being an anav, and tzanua, because no one would say that Washington was a classic humble person in the sense, or in the way that we think of, self-effacing. He knew he was important. He knew exactly who he was. And at the same time, the tzniut is a very different quality of knowing when to leave.
Yeah. And I say in Israel, you also have examples of leaders who knew when to leave. You could quibble about Ben Gurion, and he left more than once, but it's as you look at him, there are certain points where he said, I don't have to be leader. Goals might be accomplished better if I'm not leader. Same thing with Begin. When he saw that what he was doing it looked more destructive than it did helpful, he said, I'm going to act with the integrity of what it is to be the leader of Am Yisrael, of this country. And I'm going to check out and I'll let somebody else take over because that will be better for the country. So he wasn't holding on to the position because he needed that position to fulfill his vision of himself. Rather, the position was part of what he thought was valuable in life.
Let me ask sort of a strange question. Perhaps the answer is obvious, but those are all wonderful examples, whether we're speaking about Menachem Begin, David Ben-Gurion, George Washington, or Harry Truman. At the same time, why does tzniut matter? That is a quality. It's a great quality. It's wonderful. But there are plenty of good presidents and prime ministers who do not necessarily have that same quality of tzniut. So my question is, the fact that they had it is nice, but why is it integral for a leader? What does it have to do with leadership such that we should want that in a leader? There are all sorts of great qualities. Why is tzniut one of them that's indispensable?
A leader sometimes is called upon to make a decision, whether it's a policy decision, whether it's choosing who's going to be on his staff, who's going to represent his country, or leadership in other ways where, it could be leader of an organization. I think who you are is going to matter to who you choose to make common cause with. And it's also going to matter in whether the person you're dealing with or the country you're dealing with trusts you. Yes, you could fake someone out, but if you act with integrity, that means there's a reliability. Right now, if you look at leadership throughout the world, who's reliable and who's not reliable? There are some leaders who might be bad people, who might be bad leaders for their country. They're maybe representing bad values in their country, but they still might have a measured tzniut. At least they are what they are, and you can rely on them to act consistently. And there could be leaders of good countries who you can't rely on because this idea of they don't have a great depth. Rather, they're doing things. They're taking a poll every minute that they work, and so this is important because do I trust the person? And in the end, if I'm the public, am I going to want this person to continue to lead me? And even people I disagree with, are making these calculations all the time. They might say the person has integrity, I might say not, or vice versa. But I think that's a big key to leading and showing people how to live and having a country that feels united in purpose.
So I'd like to offer, and I don't want to get into politics, and I'm going to use an example, almost a negative example. And I say negative in terms of Tzniut, even though I think in many ways he's actually quite a good president in certain ways. I'm referring to Bill Clinton. Again, I don't want to talk about politics per se, but he sounds to me like somebody who might exemplify the non-tzanua way of dealing with things. For example, I was just reading yesterday, in fact, reminding myself when he hired Dick Morris as his pollster towards the end of his first term when he was in trouble after Newt Gingrich took over Congress with the Republican Revolution at the time. What Morris's expertise was finding out what everybody wants to hear. And therefore, he polled almost everything. He'd poll where he should go on vacation, no matter what it was, policy or otherwise. Even if those policies didn't reflect Clinton's core beliefs, he saw that this is what people want to hear, therefore we should move in that direction. I'm not saying Clinton always did that, but he was well known for following the pollsters. Now, it might be in some contexts that it's good. You should do what the people want. However, it's the opposite of leadership. It means following rather than leading. And it sounds to me, based on what you're saying, it's also the opposite of tzniut. It's not real integrity. It's not what you believe. It's about making sure that what everyone else believes is what you decide to represent on their behalf in order to be reelected.
Yeah, and I think you can have a society that, since it devalues tzniut, it also devalues the leader having tzniut. And so it can work that way. But to use an opposite example of how if somebody really means something, it can affect people, even though I wouldn't say that the person is tzniut in every aspect of his person. But take somebody like John F. Kennedy, who in his opening speech said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for the country. But he meant that. That was him. And people could tell that that's who he was. Put aside all the other factors that went into his personality, but that people bought into and were inspired by.
I hear. Rabbi Simkovich, actually reminds me of something that I've heard about Rosh Hashanah, because on Rosh Hashanah and continuing through the 10 days until Yom Kippur, the Seret Yemei Teshuvah, it is well known that the Shulchan Aruch recommends that people do more, that you try to do extra mitzvot, that you try to cut down on things that you aren't proud of. And some people might say in a situation like that, aren't I just faking God? Something I've heard many times. People say, God's going to see through that. And the answer that I have often heard to that problem, because it is a valid concern, just because I'm being my best self for these 10 days, what does it mean? There's a difference between being fake and being the best that you can be. In other words, Rosh Hashanah does not mean faking God out. It's almost like, to use a silly example, the way a person acts on a date. It's not that the way the person acts on a date is not true. He's just being his very best. He dresses the best that he can. He acts as dignified as he can. He tries to be as funny as he can. He tries to put his best foot forward. On Rosh Hashanah, to God, we put our best foot forward. So that's not a lack of integrity. It's integrity, but working as best as we can. So in that sense, I think that can answer some of the problems. I'm being true to myself, my best self. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, I think in a way, quite often we're in the dark, but we, see a light and we want to walk towards the light. And the closer we get to the light, the more light we get. And I think what you're describing is we're trying to do that process on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in that period of time. And we're trying to create more light and then letting that increased light influence us and then move on from there to have even more light. And I think that, again, is this whole process that we began with when we started talking. That, Torah Hashkafa is you're not a finished product. You're always trying to get better. And realize, and what Tzniut does is realize you're not faking out God with what's inside you. You should have integrity. And yes, use those things that you can use to get better. Sometimes it's something outside of you, but use those things because that is your job in life. And if you're going to have the integrity of a life well lived, that's what you've got to do. And then you end up a Ben Torah. Then you end up Bat Torah. And nobody's ever complete. And sometimes if we're open, we can see this sort of light come from different places that we don't expect.
What do you mean? Like what?
Okay, I'll give an example. My wife works for a tzedakah organization. And that tzedakah organization in Israel is known as Keren L'Yedidut. They had their board meetings in Israel. And she was part of one of those meetings. And they were shown everything that's happened lately, all the terrible stuff. And at the end, seeing as this organization really helps hundreds of millions of dollars be donated towards Israel and towards the people who need, they had a meeting with President Herzog. Now, President Herzog did a surprising thing, which I think fits the model of Tzniut exactly. He was greeting people, like as politically you're supposed to do in his role. And these organizations helping Israel. You're supposed to do that. But he took a minute as an aside, and he doesn't know I'm saying this, so this is not, a campaign for him. He might even resent my saying this. I don't know. Maybe he doesn't want this to be known. But he made an announcement. Is anybody here in this group of 30 people or 20 people, anybody here have children who are chayalim? And so a few people raised their hands. So at a certain point, he just called them over privately to the side. My wife only knows about what happened because one of these people told her. He said, look, your children are chayalim. I want to include them in my tefillot. Please give me their names, so to speak, as you would do a mishaberach for someone, so that I can include them in my tefillot. He didn't want the whole group to know. He certainly wasn't publicizing this to the whole country. It was he himself, within himself, who was saying, these are chayalim. Me, as a leader in this country, I must put my heart into this leadership. And these are my children too. And these are people who I need to be mitpalel for, both the kids and their parents, because we're all in this together. Now that's an act of integrity, because he's doing it b'tzniut. Other politicians I could imagine would say, oh, I'm going to put them in my tefillot and the Misha Berach on the bima. It's not what he's doing. So that's what I'm saying. There are certain times where you see a light and you're not looking for the light. But when you see the light, you have to go for it.
Wow, that's a great story. Let me ask you then, Rabbi Simkovich, going back to what I talked about maybe half an hour ago, how can we inculcate the quality of tzniut in ourselves? In other words, if somebody is a leader, or in some ways, each one of us at every point is a leader for somebody. I heard Rabbi Moshe Simkovich once said that when we say an Abba Rabbah in the morning, Lilmod ulilamed, to learn and to teach, because every person's a teacher. It doesn't matter whether you're actually a teacher or not. As a profession, every person has to pray to be a good teacher because we all are teaching. In that sense, all of us have moments of leadership. How do we develop this quality? Everything you've said now makes a lot of sense. I want to know practically how a person can build that quality of tzniut, meaning integrity, in him or herself.
Tzniut is, I think, founded in self-awareness. You have to know not only your strong points and your weak points, but you have to know as a principle that there's a certain way I need to act because that is both who I am and that is the right thing. And so, again, I think the best way to develop it is to A, have role models, B, make it a conscious, self-aware goal and link those role models to their goal. Like I saw just before we got on, you sent out a message from Alex Israel about Rav Amital's sayings, and that came out in a book. That's a good way to sort of, how do I create myself into a personality that Rav Amital would like? It's to me, these are qualities that it's not just a goal, but you must set it up as a goal. It's an aesthetic sense. It's living your life as principles, but also as an art of becoming better. And you can't do it unless you have this depth and you reject superficiality. And if I would err more one way or the other and say, how do I make myself into someone who does this? I would say sometimes you need to err on being hesitant about judging yourself l'kavzchut. Dan kol echad l'kavzchut, but yourself, you need to be a little critical. And I think that's part of it too, is because you have to have some way to analyze yourself. Again, not to become somebody who's milumad, but on the contrary, somebody who is, to go way back to the beginning, to Rabbi Twersky. I remember him once saying that, talking about Balei Tshuva, Tshuva is in essence part of life. He too is a Baal Tshuva. I should be, like with the understanding at all times that perhaps there's a way to improve. Without that, you just take yourself for granted. This is the way I am. It's like you're already gone.
You already mentioned going back to Rabbi Twersky. You were close to Rabbi Twersky. So going back to the beginning again, in what sense do you think his son meant that he was a tzanua? Now that we've talked about integrity, how was that manifest in someone like Rabbi Twersky? What are examples of the way he behaved that represent that quality?
I'll give you one example that Rabbi Meir Twersky used. He said he wouldn't just be mitpalel. He would do hachanot. He would prepare beforehand. And a very serious preparation, because he knew he's going to be, I would say, in my words, he's going to be talking with God. You don't do that in a superficial way. You do it with an inner depth. Not like most people run in, I made it in time for Mincha. They're only up to Poseach Es Yedecha. So I can daven with everybody and I'll get the words in. But you know what? I'm going to have to leave right after Aleinu, because I'm going to have to run out because I have the next appointment and things like that. The only way you overcome that in a life where we're all overburdened by 8 million things to do is by making a point of it. You have to set it as a principle. Once you make it as a principle, then you can move forward. But if it's just there as words, you're not going to move forward. This is an active identification with tzniut, not merely a passive recognition.
This wasn't my plan to mention this. It happens to be that this is actually our second attempt at recording this podcast. We were supposed to record this podcast the day my dad died, and obviously we had to reschedule it to now. You knew my father well as well. In fact, I was so grateful you flew in from Chicago to the Shiva House in Boston. We were together there. We were able to talk about him a bit. And frankly, in terms of tzniut, before this conversation, that's not something I would have thought about with my father in particular. Not that he wasn't, it's just not one of the qualities that I would have associated with him. But if I can say so, now that we're talking about it, again, this wasn't my plan, but as you're talking, I'm like, oh, that integrity, that really does describe my father in a way which I hadn't thought of before. In that sense that you're describing now, I say, wow, my dad was really a tzanua person.
Yeah, and it's on target. It is particularly on target when somebody doesn't make a big fuss of it. It's like it's for other people to realize that so-and-so's tzanua. In other words, that person's tzanua. We see a shadow of that tzniut that comes out in public. But the shadow is going out in public. It's not the other way, that the sun is shining out there and the shadow goes within. No, the shadow is in a depth of tzniut, which casts a different coloring to what's around. So you could call it shadow, you could call it light, but it's an intangible thing that you can draw conclusions from.
As a way of concluding, we spent this entire podcast not talking about clothing.
Baruch Hashem.
Baruch Hashem. Now that we have not talked about clothing the entire podcast, I have to at least ask about how tzniut does relate to clothing. We mentioned it a bit with regards to the pasuk in Tehillim about the daughter of the king's glory is within her. Practically, though, how does tzniut indeed relate to clothing? Because even though we didn't want that to be the focus, I don't think that we should deny that it does manifest itself somehow in clothing. So in what ways does tzniut relate to clothing in some way?
Well, I would say this. The goal is to be a person who your clothing, so to speak, reflects you and is nice, but is not there as personal PR. So in other words, we all know people who can follow all the rules and dress for effect. And we all know people who don't dress for effect and still are in the inside slovenly also. So this is not a hard and fast rule. Like if you don't dress for effect, that means you're a deep person. But I would say that the attempts of having these rules is the hope that it will foster within the person a certain consciousness. But by misidentifying the consciousness as something quantitative, like till where is your skirt, or maybe you shouldn't be walking around with such a fancy coat, or whatever it is. You shouldn't be wowing us with your richness. By misidentifying what those rules are as a goal in themselves, we don't allow it to affect ourselves. And many people are trained to, I'm wearing this because otherwise I'll be judged one way or the other. Rather than I'm wearing this because I want to be a sort of a person inside where the clothes are just part of my being, but they're not all what I am. And so, how do you affect people to have that sort of consciousness in a society as where we started with, like a Western society, where what you see is who you get? That's a very big challenge, and it's a big challenge for the Torah world that I would say is a more difficult challenge than people think, because it's also wearing a hat and a suit and looking yeshivish can also be the same thing. It could also be PR. So there's no safe way to wear clothes. All there is we have to establish this goal, which is not quantitative, as a goal. Not easy. And the only way, I think, is to go back to what we said before. Take the examples you have in life seriously. Make a conscious effort that this should be a goal, so on and so forth.
And just to conclude, I think it's important to mention that initial quote with which we started about the connection between materialism and a lack of tzniut. There could be people who wear, whether it's a man or a woman, their clothes in the perfectly religious way, so to speak, and yet they're doing so in such a way, given the emphasis on how it looks, the emphasis on the place that people see it, the fact that people do see it, the car in which you're driving when you're wearing those clothes. it completely undermines the concept of tzniut, where you're following, so to speak, the letter of the law, the quantitative law, and completely ignoring the value itself.
Right. If you imagine yourself as a Lamborghini, but if your motor isn't working, you're not a functional car.
Okay, well, Rabbi Simkovich, I think you successfully, at least for me, reframed this concept, this idea of tzniut, as a value to help people understand better where those quantitative dictates come from, what underlies the entire concept, and the importance of understanding those ideas. I'm very grateful you did this with me today, and I thank you.
It's a pleasure being here, and Shabbat Latov. The world should get better.
Subscribe to The Orthodox Conundrum on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of The Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review The Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.